The Super Mystere B2 was the first Mach 1 capable Western European production fighter and flies for France in War Thunder. Let's take a look. The French aviation industry after World War II had, in my opinion, a very realistic appraisal of their own capabilities and how the evolution of military aviation was going to play out through the end of the 1950s. They produced a series of aircraft which were all logical improvements, and they knew up front that most of them would be stepping stones. What began as the Ouragan and Mystere 3 and Mystere 4 eventually resulted in the Super Mystere. This was the first Western European fighter in regular production and service that was capable of Mach 1 and level flight, and it reached operational status in 1956. It served primarily with France, but also saw extensive combat service with Israel and Honduras all the way into the 1970s. By all accounts, its performance in real-life combat was very strong, and it was regarded favorably by all of its crews and pilots. What we have in War Thunder is the B2 variant, which was the primary production version, and almost all regular production Super Mysteres were built to the B2 specification. The weapon system on the Super Mystere is respectable, with a healthy mix of ordnance. You get a variety of bombs, rockets, air-to-air missiles, more rockets, air-to-ground missiles, and then some more rockets. For air-to-air missiles, the first one you get is the AA-20 Nord. This is a manual command line of sight missile, which means that you have to steer it into the target manually with some keybinds. This is quite difficult in practice, and takes a little while to get used to. The good news is that it has a pretty good warhead, and its proximity sensor works well, so you don't need direct hits. The big use case for this actually ends up being head-on engagements. Since you don't need to lock up the target or anything, you can fire this like an unguided rocket at someone coming head-on, and let its proximity fuse do the work. I was able to get a couple of more regular dogfight kills with the AA-20, but it's not easy, so if you're bringing this out, try to temper your expectations. You'll eventually upgrade, if you can really call it an upgrade, to the AIM-9B Sidewinder. The AIM-9B is a caged seeker rear aspect infrared missile with very entry-level performance. This isn't a dogfight missile, and most of your kills will be on people who don't know you're behind them, don't know you have a missile, or on people who don't know if they can outrun you or not, and they try to escape. The Super Mystere also gets the AS-20, which is the air-to-ground version of the Nord missile. This is another manual command line of sight missile, and its primary use is in close air support for ground RB. They aren't easy to hit with, but if you can score a direct hit, you can pop light or medium targets without any trouble. The plane also gets an enormous helping of unguided rockets. You get rocket pods, racks of anti-tank rockets out on the wings, and a unique retractable tray of rockets under the chin of the plane. An important note about that, you need to use your keybind for open bomb bay doors in order to extend the rack before firing, and also if you want to retract it back in for that tiny fractional advantage in aerodynamics. In practice, the Super Mystere's rockets aren't really great. You need a direct hit to kill a ground target, and none of them are accurate. The chin-mounted rockets end up being really more of a gimmick, and in practice I usually ended up using them to try and fire a salvo against targets coming at me head-on in the air, but this rarely got any hits. You don't have a ballistics computer of any kind, so the rockets and bombs have to be aimed blind against targets on the ground. The Super Mystere also doesn't have a regular radar set, and instead you get a radar ranging gun sight, which really doesn't do anything for you outside of simulator battles. In terms of flight performance, the Super Mystere is broadly in the same category as the F-100 and MiG-19, but in my view it falls slightly behind its two transonic cousins in a few areas, and ends up being, in practice, a little bit closer to maybe later model F-86s or the MiG-17. On the upside, you can drop combat flaps at around 600 kilometers an hour, your climb rate is pretty solid at low levels, and you've got some cockpit armor, which absolutely did save my pilot a few times while spading the Super Mystere. With that said, the Super Mystere's top-end speed at low levels is horrible, nowhere near its maximum performance, and it gets energy trapped in a vertical fight pretty easily. The flight performance is seriously skewed towards high-level combat, and since the vast majority of combat in War Thunder missions takes place at low levels, you may find yourself getting danced on in practice by aircraft which are inferior on paper. Hence why I'd rate this in performance a little bit closer to the F-86 or MiG-17 than the F-100 and MiG-19. Your engine power is skewed towards the higher end of the curve, so you accelerate better at faster speeds than you do at lower speeds, and that really holds true at all altitudes. The Super Mystere is only supersonic at higher levels, and you won't even see the structural red line unless you go into a high-speed dive. Watch your engine temps. If you keep the afterburner on for too long, you can overheat your engine. It's not a big problem, just keep an eye on it. Flying the Super Mystere out into missions gives you the choice if you want to take an air-to-air loadout or focus on ground pounding. If you're going after ground targets, you'll want to watch your teammates and clean up their leftovers, since, for the most part, all of the attackers and most of the other runway fighters are going to beat you to the ground targets. Again, the Super Mystere's low-level, low-speed acceleration is rather poor, and you'll usually be the last one off the runway and the last one into the mix. For air combat, remember that your performance is skewed towards higher altitudes, but you can't force the red team to climb. In practice, I found that most of the time when I climbed up, I ended up needing to go back down to engage people, because if I stayed up there at higher altitudes, I'd just be flying around alone until the end of the match. Pretty boring, and no points. An exception to this is when you get down-tiered. You can sometimes catch 8.0 jet bombers, and this is one of the few places where the AIM-9B and AA-20 can actually shine. At battle rating 9.0 for realistic battles, the Super Mystere is in a pretty mediocre spot. Sometimes you'll get up-tiered into F-4Cs and MiG-21s, but just as often you get down-tiered into F-84s and Meteors. Landing the Super Mystere is pleasantly simple. It may be slow to get off the runway, but getting back down is pretty basic with good air brakes. It has landing flaps that you can drop at around 425 kilometers an hour and a braking chute. Even when damaged, I had no trouble at all landing this plane, and if you have any leftover cannon ammo, you can fire it off to cut your landing run a little bit even more. Visually, I think the Super Mystere is a good-looking plane. Some people don't like that low front-mounted air intake, which is kind of similar to the F-100, but overall, I think it's a good-looking aircraft. You get some great custom skins to choose from, but I was a little let down not to find any Israeli or Honduran paint jobs on the list. The cockpit is, obviously, all in French, but the instruments are set out well and the detail is superb. Visibility is slightly above average for a plane of this era. Nothing about the Super Mystere's cockpit really stands out as amazing, but there really aren't any flaws either. Slightly above average. To close out on the Super Mystere B2, this plane gets a good selection of air-to-air and air-to-ground weapons, and has better choices than most planes at its BR. You aren't shortchanged on the cannon ammo, and you have cockpit armor that's not just dead weight. Plus, if you can lure someone up to high-altitude combat, you're gonna have a fun time. On the downside, the plane's performance suffers noticeably at lower altitudes, especially its speed, and you're leaving a lot of performance on the table below 4,000 meters or so. Its air-to-air missiles can be very difficult to use effectively, and if you take it out in a close air support role, its weapons really feel like they're behind the curve at its BR, especially without a ballistics computer. The final verdict on the Super Mystere B2 is that This is a very average transonic mid-1950s jet fighter. Very average. I couldn't find anything that really stood out as great, but also nothing that really sucked either. As always, thanks for watching.